Welcome to Study Buddy Homeschooling. In today's session, we'll be seeing different topics in Cbse Class 10, Chapter 8, How Do Organisms Reproduce? The topics that we are going to see today are: why do organisms reproduce? Do organisms create exact copies of themselves? And the importance of variation. Why do organisms reproduce? Reproduction is making copies of itself. Reproduction is definitely not an essential process like digestion, ingestion, excretion or respiration. Even without reproduction also, an organism can survive, right? And we all know that reproduction is an energy draining process, and so much of energy goes in for the preparation of the reproductive cells, formation of the reproductive cells. Yes, it's definitely not advantageous for an organism to reproduce because it's going to spend lots of energy in the process. But still, why do these organisms choose to reproduce? The key lies in the DNA. DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. This DNA is present in the chromosomes in the nucleus of the cell. This DNA is also known as the gene. They help in transmitting the hereditary information from one generation to another generation. So the urge to reproduce lies in the DNA. Innately, they have this urge to reproduce and propagate and make copies of themselves for the survival of the whole species. At an organism level, it is definitely disadvantageous to reproduce. But if you see at the species level, for the survival of the species, the DNA has to propagate itself. So that urge to propagate wins over, and hence the organisms reproduce. So reproduction is making copies of themselves. Now the question is, do organisms create exact copies of themselves? So reproduction, if you take it at the basic level, it is making blueprints of itself. It is about making copies of itself at the DNA level. So now we are speaking at the DNA level. That's where the reproduction begins. So it is the DNA which literally controls the organism. First it begins with the other cellular level. How does it do? It first makes proteins. The DNA in the cell nucleus is an information source for making proteins. If the information is changed, different proteins will be made. Different proteins will eventually lead to altered body designs. So everything boils down to DNA level when it makes copies of itself. So when the DNA makes copies of itself, so much of energy is used in the process, and so many cellular processes happen in the nucleus of the cell for the formation of the DNA copy. So now the DNA is formed. The copy of the DNA is formed. Would it be enough? No. Can the DNA survive on its own? No. It needs a whole supporting cell structure, cellular apparatus. It needs a nucleus. It needs a cell. It needs a cytoplasm. It needs all the other cellular organs for the DNA to make proteins. So it's just not enough. It just makes copies itself. It has to make the whole cellular apparatus. And hence, after it copies itself, the whole new cell structures are formed, and thus two new daughter cells are formed from the parent cell. Now the question is, how do these two daughter cells exactly resemble their parent cell, or is there any difference between them? So when we talk about reproduction, at the core level it begins with the DNA copy, which is just now we discussed that cells use several chemical reactions to build copies of their DNA. This creates two copies of the DNA in a reproducing cell, and they will need to be separated from each other. Now the question is, are these two cells, newly formed cells, how similar are they to their parent cell, or is there any differences between them? The newly formed cells may be similar but definitely not identical. there will be some slight difference between the original and the newly formed DNA copy. There will be some slight difference. This difference is known as variation. This variation is very important for the survival of the species, provided this variation is very mild and very small. If variations are very large, it's going to lead to the collapse of the whole cell. I'll tell you how. If the variations are too high, what happens is DNA codes for certain proteins and the cell structure would code for certain proteins. There will be a complete mismatch between the two because the DNA has changed completely, but the cellular apparatus is more or less the same. So there will be not much of sync between the DNA, proteins coded by the DNA, and the cellular structure. Hence, it would lead to the collapse of the cell. But slight variations at the morphological level, at the physical feature level, it is definitely advantageous and it is helpful in the survival of the species. Now let's see the importance of variation. Slight variation or mild variation at a morphological level is definitely a positive trait. How are these a positive trait? These slight variations help the organisms to cope to any environmental changes, sudden environmental changes like global warming or any other natural calamities that happens. These variation would help it to survival, for its survival. Let's see an example of bacteria. Variation in bacteria. Normally, these bacteria can survive in moderate temperatures, but there were some variants of bacteria which were heat tolerant and hence can survive in extreme weather conditions, hot conditions. So what happens is, even when the earth's temperature keeps increasing and due to global warming also, normal bacteria would have perished, but the variant bacteria which is resistant to heat survives. So in this case, the variation in the bacteria has helped in its survival. So mild variation or slight variation is a very positive trait. Now let's see an example of how to show that variation in moth population helped in the survival of their population. Prior to the Industrial Revolution era, lots of light colored moths were seen. They were able to survive easily because most of the trees before Industrial Revolution was light in color and hence they were able to camouflage better. What happened was, after industrial, even during pre-industrial era, there were certain dark moth variant. But after Industrial Revolution, what happened was, because of too much of pollution from the industries and factories, the tree bark, because of the pollution deposits, they turned dark in color. So now light colored moth became very much vulnerable and they were easily seen by their predators like birds and other animals, and they were eaten easily. Now the variation in the moth, which means it is dark colored now, it was able to camouflage nicely with the bark of the tree and hence was able to escape the predators and was able to survive and was able to propagate its species. And light colored moth literally became extinct. So in this case, the variation in the moth at the morphological level, at the physical level, has helped in its survival due to the sudden environmental change. So variation is definitely a positive trait when is it very mild and light. For queries and clarification, please contact us at studybuddyhomeschooling@gmail.com. Thanks for watching and please do subscribe to our channel. Thank you.